Welcome. My name is Gillian Caldwell, and I'm the Chief Climate Officer and Deputy Assistant Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session titled Silver Bullet or Shiny Distraction: Can AI Help Solve the Climate Crisis? Well, as you're all aware, since many of you come from a technology background, AI news is dominating the headlines, even as we confront so many other global challenges, including the climate crisis. Global disasters precipitated by changes in the climate in 2023 resulted in economic losses totaling $250 billion, affecting lives, livelihoods, and economies across the world. Some of the worst impacts of extreme weather events come when people do not have tools and information to act and prepare, like early warning before a storm or the latest seasonal forecasts to plant crops with high likelihoods of survival. There are a growing number of AI applications to help tackle sustainable development goals, including existing efforts across many sectors here at USAID. From agriculture to biodiversity, energy, and infrastructure, to, of course, climate adaptation and natural climate solutions. USAID has capitalized on these capabilities. For example, our Famine Early Warning System Network, or FuseNet, combines machine learning techniques with satellite data to estimate changes in food availability to detect famine. This can revolutionize how we anticipate and prepare for extreme weather events. We've also funded a company called Apollo Agriculture through our Development Innovation Ventures program to use satellite imaging and machine learning to discover customized information and deliver that to that alongside finance to smallholder farmers, in turn reducing rural poverty and improving food security. And yet, if climate change was a technical problem, it would have been solved by now. AI is a general purpose technology that's very wide ranging in its applications with enormous potential, but it's not a silver bullet. The intention of this session is to cut through some of the noise and arrive at some clarity about the roles and risks of AI in tackling climate change. USAID sees the embracing of potential AI responsibly as critical if we are to continue to lead in the global fight against climate change. It presents an opportunity both to amplify our understanding of complex social and environmental systems and to enhance our response capabilities in more than 80 countries worldwide where we have offices. With over a decade of experience working in digital development, USAID has committed to a future where digital technology promotes inclusive growth, fosters resilient and democratic societies, advances human rights, and empowers all, including the most vulnerable. Our AI action plan aims to make AI accessible and beneficial to underserved communities, enhancing program effectiveness while fostering sustainable development worldwide. Through this approach, USAID makes inclusion and fairness a priority rather than an afterthought, signaling the ways responsible AI can help advance our priorities by leading the way towards a more equitable digital future. In the same vein, today's session will explore how AI has been and can continue to be a catalytic tool driving progress towards climate goals. So without further ado, I want to welcome our panelists to the virtual stage. First up is Dr. Sasha Luccioni, who's calling in from London and is the climate lead at Hugging Face. She's a leading scientist at the nexus of artificial intelligence, ethics, and sustainability. She's also a founding member of Climate Change AI and a board member of Women in Machine Learning. Also joining us is Constanza Gómez Mont. She's joining from Mexico and is a strategist and impact entrepreneur. She founded C-Minds, the AI for Climate Initiative, and is head of Natura Tech LAC, co-founded with the Inter-American Development Bank Lab. So welcome both Constanza and Sasha. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you.
First off, maybe just a question for both of you. We could start with Constanza. Can you point us to some concrete examples? I gave a few in my opening thoughts, but a few concrete examples of where AI is being used effectively to tackle the climate crisis.
Of course. So let me just start with one point. Actually, in Sea Minds, we've been working specifically with biodiversity, understanding what is a nexus between AI and how can AI help stop and reverse biodiversity loss. And why biodiversity? As we for sure know, we cannot talk about climate change targets and we cannot talk about as a global community to tackle these challenges if we don't get serious about biodiversity loss. So this nexus between AI and what to do in this field becomes super important, not only because of the intrinsic value of nature and biodiversity, but also because of its, it has the potential to mitigate up to 30% of the mitigation targets. So specifically, what we've been doing throughout the years is understanding how, for example, AI can help us monitor and protect the jaguar population in Mexico. Or, for example, how can we learn through AI models how the patterns and the behaviors of manatees and whales in Latin America? And specifically, just to give a context of the challenges we're facing in Mexico, how can we create a policy that is destined to protect the jaguar population and the health of the ecosystems if we're not being able to measure A, how many jaguars, for example, exist in the area, B, if the conservation existing efforts are being effective, and C, we're not having the necessarily tools to be transparent and accountable of the actions. So basically, we've been working a few years back together with the local community to design some AI systems, understanding how can AI add specific value to this. In story short, in less than 2 months, we had thousands of images through camera traps that we installed together with the community, and then understanding how machine learning can be addressed, to understand what the patterns are for the jaguar identification. So we're not only doing this in Mexico, we're also starting to work in Ecuador and in Colombia, understanding how AI can help monitor and protect certain species that are umbrella species. I could go on and on this, but in a nutshell, AI has proven to be very successful and effective to bring both transparency and accountability and scale impact. However, of course, there's a lot of considerations to take into account.
Great, Constanza. Thanks so much. We'll be getting to some of those considerations in just a minute, but I wanted to start with the good news regarding applications. And you described, I think importantly, the opportunity for that transparency and accountability and the ways in which it can inform the development of policy, which can, of course, be systems changing and preserving natural habitat and its inhabitants. Sasha, what would you say about some concrete examples of where AI has been used on climate interventions?
Thank you. Yeah. So the way I started in this field is when we wrote a paper almost 4 years ago now. It's called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. And then after writing this paper, we founded Climate Change AI, which is a volunteer initiative to create synergies between the climate space and the AI space. And as a part of this paper, we really tried to do our due diligence. We tried to look at all the different ways in which AI can help spur climate action. And the way that I like seeing this, there are different ways of seeing it. For example, there are the IPCC categories. There are the techniques that can be used for AI, like reinforcement learning or supervised learning, large language models. But the way I like seeing it is scales. So we have everything from the molecular scale to the human size scale, like biodiversity monitoring. And then we have the satellite, like the Earth planetary level scale. So when it comes to molecular scales, what AI is really used for is for discovering new materials for batteries, because batteries are a really big part of decarbonizing our energy grids. And so we're going to have to come up with new types of batteries, because the lithium ion ones they don't hold charges long enough, essentially, and they're not optimal in the long run. And so discovering new types of molecules that can hold charges for longer, that can serve different purposes depending on the type of usage you make of them, is a really big application of AI on that scale. And on the planetary scale, there's so much data from different satellites. So you can use it for tracking deforestation. You can use it for monitoring coral reefs from space. So there's actually so much data that it's a matter of imagination of what you can do with it. And of course, at our scale, there's all sorts of applications in terms of camera trap data or bioacoustic monitoring in forests. And so I think that AI has this special ability to crunch data and to provide insights. And it's a matter of us coming up with ways to use it.
I just want to ask a follow-up question there, Sasha. You mentioned that AI has been used at the molecular level to identify alternatives to lithium-ion batteries. You also mentioned AI as relying on large data sets. We'll get to that in a minute. But can you be more concrete? If the alternatives to lithium batteries have yet to be discovered, how is AI identifying new approaches? Is it finding that kind of lost innovator somewhere in a corner in Africa, or how exactly is that happening?
So the way that AI is used for this kind of discovery is material science, essentially. And what gets fit into the AI model are different combinations of conductors that we know conduct already. So for example, lithium ion, but it's not the only type of battery. And essentially what AI can be used for is to detect patterns and detect combinations of molecules with certain properties. And it will synthesize, it will generate new molecules that are potentially candidates for promising conductivity or promising, holding a charge. And then humans can use these new combinations of molecules, and they can synthesize them and create new batteries and test them in the lab.
Understood. Okay. Well, whether it's smartphones or smart cities, all this increased digitalization we're talking about means a kind of hyper data collection and degree of intelligence that we're creating and relying upon to use this kind of AI functionality. So I want to ask each of you a similar question from a slightly different perspective. Maybe starting with Constanza. In many of the regions where USAID works, the guardrails and safeguards just are not in place from a regulatory perspective when it comes to human rights. Can you speak to the potential negative security implications for human rights and environmental advocates who are often subject to surveillance by technology such as Pegasus and can be endangered by the pinpoint accuracy that's enabled through location monitoring, for example?
Of course, and not only humans, rather also the species, coming back, for example, with the example we're doing with jaguar population, one of our first barriers that we face is, of course, to train a model, you need thousands of data sets, for the model to understand what's a jaguar, what's not, what's a cat, So our first challenge is, how do we get this data, right? We were just starting with camera traps, etc. So of course, working with allies and communities that already had data on this became crucial. However, what do you do then with a system that you have to think first of privacy? It's not only sharing data, we have to think about the privacy and the layer of security around what's being shared. Pinpointing not only people that are advocates of human rights, for example, and conservationists on locations, but also specific species, is a high risk for poachers, for example. So understanding that everything you do with the AI approach for us has to be done in a purposeful way and in a regenerative way. What do I mean with that? We have to think from the start, what are the ethical considerations, both to animals and to humans and in general, the community, around the AI development. And the second point for us is, how can we work with the community to address these challenges? For the jaguar specifically, what we did is to add security levels, anonymization, and be really strict in the data governance model around the data sharing for these species. What needs to be done in these examples in regions that we lack sometimes accountability on the implementation of these, ethical approaches is, in our opinion, working together from the start of any project with the community to address these needs. We're not only talking about privacy challenges, but also challenges of, for example, inclusion, challenges, for example, of shared benefits, challenges, for example, of the governance systems. How can these be AI systems be inclusive at all scales? So I believe that privacy, of course, is a medular point of anything that is done with AI, especially for the climate and the biodiversity space. However, there are other layers to be considered that are important as well. At the end of the day, and I'll close with that, social justice and social equity has to be at the core of any AI development and adoption. And privacy is one layer of that.
Thanks so much, Constanza. Just for our audience, please feel free to send us any questions. I will be getting questions in chats, and we'll get to them in just a few minutes. So welcome any thoughts you might have or questions. So moving to you, Sasha, people marvel at, what AI can do and so quickly. And as you know, because you're very technically minded, I can tell, the computing power required to generate these fabulous responses is just enormous. I mean, it's unprecedented. The load being required has jumped exponentially as AI users continue to grow. So, and we're talking about the climate crisis, of course. So how do we ensure that this AI boom doesn't lead to an even larger environmental and carbon footprint, countering the very problem we're trying to solve?
What's interesting is that there's a bit of a contradiction and enigma here, because the approaches that we hear about, that Constanza has spoken about, that I mentioned, for example, about molecular discovery, they're not particularly computationally intensive. And yet approaches like large language models, and increasingly we're seeing multimodal models, so images and text together, are more and more computationally expensive. And they, according to me, they have yet to prove their utility in fighting the climate crisis. And so what we're seeing is that, AI is definitely a very broad umbrella term, but in general, AI's footprint is growing, energy footprint is growing, carbon footprint is growing. And yet the growth is not because often you hear, well, we're doing all this computation, maybe it's, at the end is going to solve climate change. But what I'm seeing is that the methods that are requiring the most computation have the least probability of solving climate change, if that even was a thing. And yet all these relatively efficient, quite lightweight approaches that can run on your laptop have this great potential. And so it's interesting, because as someone working in this field, I'm constantly torn between saying, yes, AI's carbon footprint is growing, but it's more complicated than that in terms of the climate impact. And that's why I started the work that I do, because 5 years ago, someone asked the question, you're fighting the climate crisis with AI, but what if you're doing more harm than good? And that's when I started researching the energy requirements and carbon footprint of AI models. And what I found, especially in my recent studies, is that really these large language models are so big and need so much data that they blow all other kind of applications out of the water, like image classification, object detection. All these different methods that are used in climate positive ways are really dwarfed by these enormous language models that need a lot of compute.
But the question was real. Okay, so you're disputing the premise, which is fair. But it's still the case that some of these, what you would describe as less efficient AI interventions that are so computationally intense, are a huge drag on the energy system. I know that many technology companies have stepped forward to make their own net zero commitments and are working to power these data centers with renewable energy. Maybe segueing from that question to the role of policy and government and the public sector in addressing AI. Maybe, Sasha, could you comment on what you see the government as needing to do at this stage? And I think one of the problems we're certainly having here in the United States is that the government officials lag well behind the technologists in terms of the understanding of what's going on. So we're not seeing policy keep pace with the reality, either the carbon footprint or the human rights and privacy considerations. So, Sasha.
Well, actually, yeah, in the United States, you do have several programs that at least bring domain expertise to people in power. So, like the OSTP, like the Fellows program, like you do have at least some pipeline, at least some connections. But for example, in Canada, where I'm from, there's zero connections between the government and research. And so it's really, really hard to even make that bridge. But I do agree that government has a role to play. I think that currently the most impactful role for policymakers would be mandating transparency, because we're in such a creative chaos and a lack of information about these models and their human rights implications, the biases, the energy costs, like all of that is not communicated to us. So as users of these black box models, all we see is these, shiny answers, or these the promise that they're going to solve all of our problems and not the cost. And so I think that currently at the stage we're at, the government should step in and say, okay, well, maybe we're not regulating, we're not like enforcing, we're not forcing you to stop doing what you're doing, but at least be transparent about it. And maybe I'm a little naive, but I believe that once users especially start seeing the cost of these models, both in terms of human labor, as in energy, as carbon emissions, they're going to think twice. Because currently I talk to people who are like, oh, I stopped using a calculator, I use ChatGPT now for calculations. And I'm like, it's like thousands of times more compute, but they don't know that. And so I'm kind of convinced that once people start seeing the cost of these systems, then they'll start making more informed decisions. And especially also organizations have more and more commitments to net carbon zero or whatnot, right? And so they can take this into account when taking their decisions.
Yeah. Well, maybe on a related note, Constanza, whether it's policy or otherwise, I mean, how do we ensure that AI doesn't just exacerbate an already existing digital divide? And how do we ensure in places where USAID works, which are, the low and middle income countries around the world, in Latin America and Africa, Asia and beyond, how do we ensure that those communities have the options to be creators of this technology, not just consumers? Because we hear so much about, the sort of discrimination inherent in AI algorithms and how a self-driving car is more likely to hit someone with a dark skin tone than a light skin tone. How do we deal with these kind of equity dimensions in AI? And does policy have a role in that context, Constanza?
Of course, and going just one step back into the energy and the need for decarbonizing the AI ecosystem in general, a point that is a nexus between this question and the past one is also, for example, it's not only energy, right? Water consumption, for example, of the data centers, it's huge. And in regions such as Latin America and many others, we're not the only one, that lack specific policies and regulations for companies just coming in and, because of the richness of natural resources, coming in and establishing data centers where there are places where already have water scarcity, and then consuming such water without the participation or knowledge of communities that live there becomes not only a practical, economical question, but an ethical one. We have to rethink how the development and the massive use of, for example, large language models are affecting not only the practical energy sense, but the broader social equity approach and conversation around this AI. And towards your specific question on access. For example, us in Naturtech and C-Mines and what we do, there's no way we can start an AI-driven project without first understanding what are the problems together with the community. So I believe like this, techno-solutionism on let's just sprinkle AI, and solve the biodiversity and climate crisis, and then just external actors coming in sometimes and just like wanting to prove the value of their AI systems and just like, understand and adopting it. Rather, there's a very strong need to take one step back. One is how can we start to understand not only what AI can do, but what are the real problems, and the challenges on site together with the community. Once that is solved, how can you create a governance system where the community indeed is not a beneficiary of whatever is done through AI systems, but a partner throughout the entire life cycle of the project. When we talk about equity, it's not only as well as inclusion, but also the shared benefits. And I'll stop there with a really strong emphasis on shared benefits, because I believe there's extraordinary examples of what AI is doing. For example, the biodiversity credits that are emerging. But the question at the end of the day is, are the benefits being distributed in a fair way? And I believe not only protocols and ethical considerations are needed, but a very specific policy of what inclusiveness and justice means.
Thanks so much, Constanza. I have a question for you from B. Spadaccini. Can you please give a specific or practical example of community participation in the ethical use of AI to pursue common good goals in LAC?
Of course. So I'll give an example of what we're doing. For example, we're starting in Nuquí, Colombia, which is one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. And actually, it's the place where the whales are born. So it's called the womb of the world for whales. When we started to talk, with the leaders on the ground that are doing an extraordinary work, we saw that there were certain challenges, that could be addressed if we added a technological layer together with traditional knowledge. So I pinpoint this because sometimes when we come from the tech field, we think that only like putting our knowledge systems on modern science is enough, when actually that's a very wrong approach to conservation. So understanding the power of traditional knowledge and understanding the merge between modern science becomes a nexus that is at the pinpoint of these discussions together with the local community. So specifically what we're doing here is understanding and working in partnership with the local community to understand what are the challenges for biodiversity monitoring, conservation, and scaling and financing, and then adding our knowledge on modern science, and then they're adding their knowledge on traditional knowledge and coming up together with a program. So I believe when you do this approach from the start, working in partnership, not with beneficiaries, but in partnership with local communities, then it becomes very natural that the ethical questions are going to be addressed because they have a seat in the table from the start, both in the design and in the implementation.
Thanks so much for that. We've got another question actually, which is sort of challenging the premise of the conversation. Can AI really be used for good when it comes to the climate crisis, given resource use? Abdel Razik Risk is specifically pointing to the water consumption, which you mentioned, Constanza. So I'm going to ask you both to think about one best use case scenario when it comes to climate interventions in AI, because we know they do exist. But just wanted to read back some of what I've heard from you both here, especially for people who may have joined a little bit late. One is that AI really helps us monitor and map patterns, helping generate transparency and understanding regarding the effectiveness of interventions. Another is that social justice and social equity really need to be centered in the AI solutions we propose. A third, and this is kind of where we began with comments, relates to going from the micro to the macro. AI amplifies human capacity to understand what we're seeing, whether it's from the micro scale, looking at sort of subatomic level materials, or to the planetary scale, drawing on things like satellite imagery to understand deforestation. It's also clear from what you both have said that policy could really demand more transparency. We could get more government engagement in problematic areas such as bias and human rights and energy usage. And we could have governments seeking more transparency and reporting regarding the uses of AI. Also, I heard you say that, putting knowledge, sort of situating it on top of modern science is not enough. There has to be this partnership with local organizations to kind of co-create knowledge and understanding and advance it moving forward. And I think that really resonates with us at USAID, where we have a big emphasis on localizing development programming. How do we make our programming more accessible? How do we ensure it's better informed by local communities? How do we ensure that local communities are actually the beneficiaries, the ones being empowered and funded to do this work? So yeah, thank you for all of those thoughts. So in closing, with just 1.5 minutes left, can you each take maybe 30 seconds to give us your best-in-class example that comes to mind when it comes to climate interventions, maybe starting with you, Sasha?
I think that it's important to see AI as a tool and not as a goal in itself. And the biggest success stories I've seen is when domain experts learn some techniques or adopt some models that help them in things that they've already been doing, just to kind of make them simpler and more streamlined. So that's where I try to focus on, and adding AI to that complex tech stack or domain expertise stack that they're already using.
And for me, I would emphasize that we cannot talk in silos. We cannot talk about technology in an isolated way. We have to talk about the cultural dimension, the economic dimension, the social dimension, the biological dimension, and then understand how AI can work towards putting nature at the center of a new economy. And that requires not only very practical uses of AI, but also a culture and mindset shift towards what is, an economy based in nature.
Well, thank you both, Sasha and Constanza, for your reflections today. Really appreciate that. And, we've, of course, as humans, really achieved remarkable things in terms of molding and engineering nature to our benefits, from rivers to modes to mining and computational models. And it has led to a lot of advances in human and social well-being. But, the big question we have now is, can we harness that human ingenuity and intelligence in a co-creative way towards an augmented collective intelligence that generates better results? Because obviously, we're not doing a great job when it comes ultimately to the ability for people on this planet to survive and thrive. And we've got an enormous challenge on our hands. So thank you both for your time, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.